Welcome to L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. This is a special part 2 episode with Dario Alberto Magnani, where we discuss fencing. Yeah, let's go ahead and let's move on to you a little bit because outside of the weapon masters, you're also a fencer. So let's talk a little bit about fencing. Tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in the Bolognese system. Or, well, not in the Bolognese system because I guess you do Bolognese. Yeah.
I also do Bolognese,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Um, my martial arts career, we can say, started rather early because I was into judo as a kid. But I think that's I don't know how you call it in English. In Italian, we call it a supercazzola. So, I'm joking on you if I say that that's the start of my martial arts career. Okay, I was 11. Uh, when talking about more serious stuff and HEMA, I started off in like 2009, 2008,
Mhm.
around there. I was 15, 16, and yeah, so it's probably 2007. And I started off with a reenactment group because a high school friend, hooked me up with his reenactment group. That was one of the few reenactment groups that had structured courses for the winter season and was already studying from manuals and stuff like that. So I started off from Fiore's works, and then moved on to some Bolognese and went through some of Marozzo and Manciolino, and then went on mostly Fiore, and then I started dipping on Vadi. So that was the progress of my martial arts and HEMA studying career. Then, of course, as you keep studying, you get better, and as you keep getting better, you try competing, and as you compete and go well, you start teaching and everything.
Yeah.
Uh, so over the course of time, I moved on to I don't say I'm a furist anymore. Today I say I study the fencing of the early Renaissance or late medieval period in northern Italy. So I call it transitional Italian fencing.
Nice. Yeah. That's a trend that I keep seeing. People not really focusing on really just trying to focus on like northern Italian fencing or like you're saying like transitional Italian fencing and this idea of just not quite looking at something as just this specific thing that's constrained to a specific area or a school or an approach and really trying to look for the thing that really unifies all Italian fencing, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that that's sort of a natural development for the kinds of fencers, at least um, that perceive themselves as scholars.
Hmm.
So I started off with Fiore, as I said, but as you go on studying, especially Fiore, and the more you understand Fiore, the more you realize that he's relying on a luggage of knowledge of the person he is teaching to that we don't have.
Yeah.
Because I haven't been studying under him and I haven't been fencing for 10 years, 20 years. And so I realized that probably I needed to understand the wider luggage of fencing knowledge that was around to better understand what he was teaching. And over time, I realized that the more I dabbed between Vadi, Fiore, and Marozzo, the more I was starting to use the same language or the same um, mental codification of actions
Mhm.
when looking at one or the other. So the more I went on with this, the more I started seeing like uh, a thrust from Guardia Entrare not being very different from other actions you can see in Fiore, with the difference of the weapon, obviously. But I think that my evolution has been probably the opposite of the one that people that come from sport fencing to HEMA have. So
Mhm.
they see the basics and then develop the specifics. I probably started off from the specifics and then tried to understand the shared basics
Yeah.
around them.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that's for HEMA. I think that's the way that a lot of people end up going, you know? Like you really do kind of focus on because we have the text and we are reading, you know, um, do you know who Jake Norwood is? He's a
Sorry,
do you know who
Jake. Yes,
Jake yeah. So like Jake
I
Norwood
actually
right
met
now.
him.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So like for him, his whole progression is he was studying Lichtenauer and then he realized that wait a second, if everybody's doing Lichtenauer, that doesn't quite make sense. So he went back and now he's done a lot of lectures and stuff like that as he's gone around to events or even doing things online, really trying to understand what common fencing was to those people and why Lichtenauer works against a common fencer, you know?
Yeah,
And
I've
so,
actually read some of their stuff about common fencing. I think they set up. It wasn't just him; probably it was two or three people, and I
yeah,
think they set up something on a website. I kept reading it for some time. Then, obviously, not being a Lichtenauer practitioner, I didn't go too far into it. But I remember that came out some time ago, a few years maybe.
yeah. And so he's kind of refined it over the years, but it's really interesting. You know, I think that a lot of people will kind of do that. I mean, if anybody were to ever start with Marazzo, they wouldn't have a choice but to go back and try to figure out what the heck was going on because, you know, Marazzo oftentimes is like, hey, you know, Sebastian, my son that you're probably like 18, 19, 20 years old at this point, and he's sitting there talking to Sebastian. And he's like, yeah, you'll remember this because I taught you in the Sal, remember? And then you're like, as a
That's
reader, you're just like,
exactly
this makes
that,
absolutely no sense.
that's exactly what happens with Fiore. And that's the same that you see in Fiore's work because he unequivocally tells you that um, the person that the book is for has been studying under him for quite some time. He has been giving him lessons with only he says that I've given you lessons with them lessons with only their stricter parents and relatives and no one outside to tell them the secrets and stuff like this. So everything that's in the book has already been explained frontally to the recipient. And we also have to consider that Fiore's students were um, renowned duelists, renowned fighters, renowned combatants. Just think that his most famous student, in his opinion, is Galeazzo Cattaneo, who was famous for winning duels. Okay,
Yeah.
before getting to study under Fiore. So uh, if we lack the not really basic knowledge Galeazzo had, we will struggle understanding what is actually important, relevant, and how it is structured in Fiore's work. And that's probably the same with Marozzo.
Yeah.
Not as bad, probably, but still there.
It's pretty bad with Marazzo. I mean, you have to really have a good understanding of the rest of the Bolognese system to come back to Marazzo to kind of figure out what he's doing. Like it's it's not hard to figure out the actions necessarily as he lays them out because there is a lot of writing. But if you really want to understand Marazzo tactically, you almost like, especially let's just take something like Sword and Large Buckler. If you really want to understand Marazzo tactically, you almost have to go back to Manciolino, who gives much better
Yeah,
explanation and understand Manciolino so that way you can come back to Marazzo and figure out what the heck he's saying, or at least what he's getting at. Because Marazzo, if you do that, Marazzo actually gives you things where Manciolino treats it very simply. Marazzo starts adding complexity that's like, oh, wow, okay, now I understand because Manciolino was giving me this provocation or this attack. And now Marazzo's expanding on that exact action. And now that makes sense.
yeah. The way our school approaches it, in fact, is working on Marozzo and Manciolino together. as a wider system, so
Mhm.
that we use the basic structure and understanding of actions that Manciolino gives you, and put it in the context that Marozzo gives you with the assaults and everything,
Yeah.
so that you have the understanding of the fencing from Manciolino, which is simple, and then you pump it up with Marozzo, who explains you. Uh, the way I put it is Manciolino explains you the why, and Marozzo explains you the how.
Yeah.
If you don't go through Manciolino, you know what you're going to do, but you don't know why, which is what you expressed as um, tactically.
Yeah.
You know what you have to do, but you don't know why you do it, so you don't know when to do it. You don't
Yeah.
have the
Exactly.
tactic.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah. So you were talking about studying Vadi a little bit. I think Vadi is pretty interesting, because I know that there's not a direct historical correlation, at least that we know of, but I feel like Vadi almost feels like this evolution to something that really kind of drives into and fits into the Bolognese system. Like he's got some really interesting actions.
The way I put it is that Vadi is doing Bolognese with a two-handed sword.
Hmm.
So that's why I think Vadi is my ring of connection between the two systems, because as someone who studied Bolognese and who had studied Fiore, going through Vadi has been an eye opener on several things. Vadi himself says he invented the double step. How do you call it in English?
Like the gathering
I,
step, or
the doppio passo, double step. I don't know how you call it in English. By the way, getting your feet near and then getting the first foot away and then getting the second feet near and then the first foot away. And he basically claims to have more or less invented it. I don't think so, because he's a bit of a loudmouth, but yeah, he likely was kind of. But still, even if I don't fully believe a majority of what he is writing in his book, that's to be said before we go on. I don't believe a majority of what Vadi writes in his book, uh, for several reasons, but we're going to expand on that later, maybe. But still, I think that it has a large value as a proof of its time. So it's in between Fiore and the Bolognese school, and it's showing something that very much feels in between the two. So if he was an actual fencing master, or if he was just copying someone else's work, in any case, he's showing you a slice of his time in fencing,
hmm
and that very slice of his time in fencing shows us something that clearly comes from the same tradition, the same common tradition of Fiore's time, and yet it is clearly evolving towards Bolognese. So you have a different kind of stepping, a different kind of tactical approach, a different weight on thrusts, and yet he seems to be clinging to the fencing that was before.
hmm
So that's the real transition, in my opinion. Trying to cling to the old kind of fencing. He tells you, I only value the fencing with the two-handed sword
hmm
and all that sort of stuff, in a period where you were not allowed to fence with two-handed swords in a duel with sharps. So is he talking about?
Yeah.
And yet uh, he seems to be clinging to the stuff he has been taught, probably, or has been reading more, probably, in my opinion, and yet he is showing us the rest of the world isn't anymore doing that. We even have a passage in Vadi's work, which is something I find pretty interesting. I think that's the very first mention of a side sword um, as we mean it today.
Hmm.
Obviously, he's saying sword because it
Mhm.
was the sword.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
side sword
Yeah.
is a modern word, meaning side sword as the weapon you can bring around town and you can duel with in the city.
Hmm.
He tells you, and again, this is another unpopular opinion, okay? But he tells you that if you find yourself cornered, uh, you probably don't want to fence with a two-handed sword.
Hmm.
With that sword, he says, but he's been talking of a two-handed sword up there, and you'd want to fence with something lighter and more maneuverable.
Interesting.
So call it the way you want. Telling me that it's a smaller two-handed sword or whatever, but
Yeah.
to me that pretty much qualifies as a sword you can bring on your side if you are cornered in the town.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes
So
sense. It makes perfect sense.
does it have the rings and everything? I don't know, but still, for the period you start having that kind of stuff, we start having some sorts of that kind around in museums that date around there,
Hmm.
and you have someone claiming to be a fencing master telling you if you get caught in the streets, throw away the two-handed sword and take out something lighter and smaller and more maneuverable. And I have already invented the double stepping, and I want you to thrust.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
okay.
Yep. Yeah. No, I like it. I'm on board. You, no controversial opinion there for me. I like that. Well, I mean, yeah, we see interesting anecdotes like that where, they're talking about the single-handed sword being good for, if you get caught in a difficult situation in streets and stuff like that. I mean, that's pretty much all of Godinho, right? I mean, he's just, if you ever get jumped in the
You can
street.
swing around the big one.
Exactly. Yeah. So what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced in developing your interpretations, and how have you overcome them?
So, given the specific scope of my interpretation, so that of the transition between the two kinds of fencing, uh, I would say that one of the major obstacles, if you can call that an obstacle, probably not, but one of the major resistances I
Mhm.
found uh, probably are the Bolognese community and the Fiore community, meaning that uh, coming up with the idea that there's more of a shared fencing between the two, and working between both traditions and through both traditions, uh, not only to find the differences, but also to complement. I wouldn't say complement one with the other, but at least complement my understanding of one with my understanding of the other tends to get quite some resistance usually.
Hmm.
Um, so again, that's not an obstacle because I don't give a damn, but
Yeah.
uh, generally, it is very difficult to talk with theorists about an action, trying to explain it um, through a Bolognese action. So, what if I gave you this and I did this, and then opening Fiore and saying, this is the same action, right?
Yeah.
And there's some kind of resistance there usually. Uh, not always, and not a hard one, but it's some sort of ingrained idea that um, they are two completely different things,
Yeah.
and that takes some time to overcome sometimes.
Yeah. Well, you
Um,
know, uh, the interesting thing is a lot of a lot of people that I know, um, who are especially interested in the two-handed sword specifically, right?
mm,
Um, when it comes to Marazzo, because Murato is vague, like we've already talked about how, like, I mean, just looking at sword and large buckler, you have to take Manciolino to fill in the gaps to understand Murato, right? But the problem is there's no other two-handed sword source that we can use that fills in the gaps for Murato. And so, I mean, I know that some people now, at least in the United States, they'll look to, well, what's the KDF answer for this action, right? Like, what's the Lichtenauer answer for this action? Well, can we apply that to Marazzo? And I don't necessarily think that that's 100% correct. Like, why aren't we looking at Vadi or Fiore for the answer to that action instead? And why are we going with something that's probably, I mean, I think there's plenty of continuity between the two in terms of there were Germans in Italy all the time, right? I mean, that's pretty much
I have an answer for you about this.
yeah.
At least this is my answer, obviously, but another kind of resistance I usually get is when I say that um, you can speak Lichtenauer in Fiore, but you can't speak Fiore in Lichtenauer. So uh, I think that the Italian tradition in general is written down trying to explain concepts in I would call it a Latin way. So uh, it's structured in an iterative way and has kept clinging to that kind of iteration, which started probably around Fiore's time and has lost its meaning, keeping the names. So you still have the boar guard.
Hmm.
Marozzo calls it the boar guard of the iron door, while Fiore calls it the guard of the boar's tooth. But what's that? It's a guard from which you strike to the hands with false, okay, or with a thrust, or with a false thrust. But if you try to explain this with KDF words, I don't think you can convey the same meaning.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that there's a very high compenetration between KDF, early KDF, and Fiore, but it is very difficult to explain Fiore through KDF language. Well, I can generally uh, explain KDF through Fiore's language because the two are differently structured. KDF is scientifically structured,
Yeah. Typical
and
German.
Fiore is explained by hand. It is explained more probably grossly, and yet being less specific in things has created a platform of tactical use of things
Yeah.
that allows you to better explain other kinds of fencing. And so why I think that Marozzo can be easier to understand through Italian sources than through German sources, not necessarily because there's less compenetration in fencing terms,
Hmm.
but in cultural and explanatory terms.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't use even contemporary German sources to try talking about Marozzo, but still, I think that the two kinds of fencing, the two fencing traditions, aren't as far apart as some people seem to like to think. I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know we so our school has essentially two branches. We have one that focuses primarily on Renaissance fencing and mostly Northern Italian fencing. And then we have another one that focuses mostly on medieval stuff and then really kind of focuses, its primary focus is KDF.
Mhm.
And we actually have some people right now who are, after studying KDF for a long time, are going into Fiore and finding that Fiore really unlocks a lot of KDF. And
Yeah,
that's
because
it's really
it,
fascinating to me. Like you said, I mean, like Fiore, you can understand, you can understand KDF better if you understand Fiore, but it's not quite the other way around. Like, but
Yeah,
Fiore helps to inform that in a way.
yeah, because I think that KDF is so closed on its own terminology. It has a term for everything.
Yeah.
I mean, you strike from above downwards. Fury calls it a fendente and fuck off. Okay,
Yeah.
that's it. It goes, in my opinion, a fendente follows gravity. Okay, it doesn't. It is gravity positive. So you go from a higher potential energy to a lower potential energy. However you do that, that's a fendente. And
Yep.
then you go to PDF and you have the Oberhau, the Zornhau, and the whatever how, and you can't really say fendente. You don't have an equivalent term while you throw a strong fendente, that's a Zor.
Yep.
So you can speak KDF in Fiore, but you can't speak Fiore in KDF to me.
Yeah, it's funny too because these language problems oftentimes really kind of lead into some interesting rabbit holes. I was just with one of my fellow practitioners. I was just actually just having a conversation about, you know, we were talking about the right way to cut a mandrito, right? And so Manciolino and the Anonimo both say that when you cut a mandrito, it should go from the ear down through the knee, right? That's pretty steep. That's a pretty steep cut. And then they say the fendente goes down the middle of the head, right? And but the thing is, then you get Marazzo, who just like wrecks everything, and then he gives us the segno where he has a picture of a man, and he's got
Yep.
the Mandrito coming, the Mandrito Squalembrato coming through, and so like the Anonimo and Manciolino both just call it a Mandrito. They don't use Squalembrato. That's just like, yeah, whatever. But then you get Marazzo who throws all these extra terms in there and just makes everything super confusing. And then his cut looks like it's coming more at like 50 degrees or something like that. It's not that steep cut that's going through the head. So what is a mandrito, Like what but even the
Yeah,
Bolognese sources don't agree.
but that's inherited from a century before because if you go checking on, there's been years of debate of what's the proper angle for a fendente, okay?
Yeah.
Because it's drawn in a way and then written in another one. So you have him, there's the nine swords diagram in Fiore, okay, which shows the directions of the cuts more or less like the segno from Marotto.
Mhm.
And you have fendente going basically 60 degrees down, and Fiore tells you it should enter here and exit at the knee, more or less. And then he describes fendente as the strikes that goes through your teeth. So I don't have teeth here. Okay. Uh, so, so my opinion on that is that probably trying to limit the direction of a blow to a specific entry point and exit point at a specific distance is that sort of KDF kind of thing that requires you to have 5 different strikes for what Fiore calls fendente.
Yeah.
And that is probably inherited in the Bolognese system. So you have one trying to give you the direction and one trying to give you the best entry point, and none of the two telling you this is the preferred one.
Yeah. Yep.
It's not like you're not hitting him on the clavicle, you're hitting him in the shoulder, nothing happens. No, that's not how it works, okay?
Right.
The shoulder hurts as much as the clavicle.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's awesome. And you know, I just think it's funny, we find ourselves in these kind of crazy debates where we're just like constantly going through the text and finding things that don't fit and kind of finding our way through things. But it does seem right that that transition does need to really kind of come through the Italian sources. I don't, one of the arguments that I've seen to the contrary is that Fiore wasn't widespread enough to to really have made it. We don't know that there was a copy in Bologna, so we don't know that the Bolognese had a copy of it, and thinking that that system sort of developed in its own sort of merit.
Yeah, I,
But
I've I've gone through this argument too, but I think that uh, the answer is pretty simple in my opinion, though it isn't verifiable. Okay, but if we want to exclude the fact that Fiore himself tells you that he's been studying his stuff through the whole of Germany and Italy from different masters, and he keeps naming some, and then he keeps naming people he trained.
mhm,
So I think that's a purely modern Hemaist um, mental block to think that the fact his treatise didn't reach many places,
yeah, that's a great
his
point.
fencing didn't.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And that's one point. Second, he explicitly tells you, I've been gathering this stuff around the whole of Europe, which means that kind of fencing more or less happens throughout a majority of the Holy Roman Empire at the very least.
sure.
So the fact that Fiore's manual, even Fiore's teaching, wasn't that widespread doesn't mean that the common tradition from which it drew wasn't that widespread. Should it be a case that Marozzo has a guard that's called the boar? I mean, are we joking?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that one way or another, at least the general common, you call it fencing, from which Fiore drew his understanding and which he reworked into his own fencing, which probably isn't that different from the one others were fencing, uh, probably was through the whole area. And this is why I say I'm trying to be a scholar of Northern Italian transitional fencing more than Fiore's work, because Fiore's work itself is part of a wider tradition. And while we don't have direct uh, primary proof of the passages between one and another, or the existence of other people that were fencing similarly to Fiore, at least, sharing the same guard names or the same intentions when taking a guard, I think that's pretty safe to assume that probably there was a shared tradition and he didn't invent something out of nowhere, especially since when you go checking Lichtenauer stuff,
hmm,
you have a majority of things that look pretty much the same or are used pretty much in the same way once you understand Fiore correctly.
yeah,
And this is probably a limit of a good part of the Fiore community. Some get too stuck with not wanting to uh, implement the direct knowledge from the single treatise with what's around it, and so they sometimes don't see uh, the wider picture around it. I
yeah.
mean, when I say that Von Tag and Posta di Donna are at least relatives as guards,
Oh yeah,
some people go, eek! Because one is described in a way and the other one is described in another one. And true, they are not the same guard, but still there's so much compenetration between the two that probably if you sum up all of the guards Fiore is teaching you and you sum up all of the guards Lichtenauer is teaching you, you get the same array of actions available.
yeah,
So probably there's a shared tradition.
yeah. No, that's a great point. And something that I thought of while you were talking about that is, you know, to your first point, uh, you know, Lichtenauer. We know that the Lichtenauer tradition is an oral tradition, right? Like it's written down as a poem. The
Yes.
Zettel is a poem. and it was written that way for a specific reason. It's so that way it could be passed around orally. And the manuscripts that we have for Lichtenauer are people who knew the poem, took the poem, and wrote down notes based on what they understood about fencing based on the poem, right?
What they had been teaching about that fence, taught. Uh,
Taught, yeah, you
past,
got it.
okay, taught. What based off what they had been taught from others
Yeah,
about the stuff that's talked about in the poem.
exactly.
So there's at least two people doing that fencing for anyone that wrote a manual, them and their teacher, at the very least.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
That's not an exclusive fencing of one person. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so to that point, the idea that if Fiore had taught somebody, that that person probably taught other people, especially when you think about the time, with the Italian wars going on. I mean, there's a relative period of peace in the 1400s, but for the most part, the latter half of the 1300s was such a violent time, with the different mercenary captains and things like that. You think about John Hawkwood, and there was so much interplay of ideas. And what's to stop me if I'm Bushido, for example, from saying, okay, I need to teach these men at arms how to fight with a longsword. Fiore taught me, well, I'm going to go ahead and teach these guys how to fight with a longsword because my life depends on it.
Well, that's surely a point, but I think it's slightly different from the point I was making before.
Yeah,
Um, just to be sure that I understood, I think that Fiore's work comes from several other people teaching him,
yeah,
which means that not only his heritage, so what he is leaving to others,
gotcha.
has
So,
probably gone around, but what was before him was probably going around even without him. I
yeah,
mean, the person who taught, one of the people who taught Fiore, very likely taught at least another person. If they were
sure.
master at arms, at least another 50 persons. I mean, okay, over their life. So there's probably 40 or 50 other people outside of Fiore who were taught by the same people who taught him the stuff he knew.
Yeah,
So for how much he may have reworked it a bit or summarized it or whatever, overall, I think there are many other people that were into his same tradition, not his own tradition, but his same
yeah,
overall tradition. And also, he tells you that he spent a whole lot of money to be taught all of that fencing.
mm,
This is not to be disregarded because it means that he didn't go around looking for someone to beg to teach him fencing or he was taught for duels or whatever. He was studying. He tells us, I have spent as much as someone would have spent in the university to become a doctor
mhm.
several times. So he considers himself a student, a doctor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's a great point because, like you were saying, Fiore's master probably taught many other people,
Yeah,
and they might not have been as good as Fiore. Regardless, they still understood whatever that teacher was teaching. So this sort of there's already, if we were to think about it like a chain, right? And just think
yeah,
of,
actually,
there
probably.
could be hundreds of data points here that are gonna create, at least, I don't you could 5 to 20 data points of their own,
Yeah,
and we're gonna get this huge web coming down. And
yeah,
if we look at Fiore and we look at his tree, and we know there are at least 30, right? But we don't know how many. I mean, those 30 could turn into 120. They could turn into 150, right?
yeah. They can turn
So
it to 1,000, in my opinion.
yeah,
I
exactly.
mean,
So, and if we have
so
even more data points that are around, we're looking at a pretty big branch, and there's probably an established system that was around. That's a
so
really
get,
great point.
getting back to the first objection, but we don't know if Fiore's manuals ever got to Bologna. Who cares?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
That was my point.
Yeah.
It's not tied to Fiore, his direct teachings and his manuals. I'm talking about the whole tradition that was around the fencing he learned and then transmitted.
Yeah.
That's a tradition, not
Well,
just in being the head of it. That's a our way of thinking.
yeah. It's hard not to look at Marazzo's dagger and not see Fiore and Fiore's dagger, right? Like, and so like Fiore tells you with with his dagger that you can you can do this one of two ways. You can do this to not hurt the person, or you can do it as if you were fighting for your life, right? And then he tells you
Yeah,
to do it as if he's like, and I'm going to teach you how to do it if as if you're fighting for your life. And then when you look at Marazzo's, he tells you every single play with the dagger, he's telling you that somebody is trying to murder you. And he's like, and this is how you're going to stop them from murdering you. And you can do this in one of two ways. You can either do this to just throw them to the ground, or you can break their arm. And when I read that, I'm like, wow, this reads exactly like Fiore, not just from that specifically, but if you look at the specific plays, the plays are more or less Fiore. Um, and it's, I don't know, it's crazy.
yeah. Also, I think that that's another point where Vadi makes for a very great connection between the two, because between all of his talking about the art that is dying and him wanting to transmit it and writing the book and whatever, he then goes on teaching you dagger. And if you go around Vadi's dagger, that's brutal. I mean, a good deal of Vadi's stuff evidently is about being attacked uh, around town,
Hmm.
or uh, targeted by assassins and stuff like this. There's even a few plays where the the, the person during the play is turned the other direction and attacked from behind and grabbed at the shoulder, and he turns around and puts the dagger inside the other guy's guts.
Yeah.
So Vadi's dagger really gives you the idea of for the life, for your life, while Fiore's dagger evidently is a dagger fight. Vadi's dagger evidently is a dagger assault.
Yeah. No, Maratsu's the same way. And that's what's really interesting because, you know, and that's what he's kind of what he's getting at, is that yeah, somebody's trying to kill you, and it feels like it's an assault more than it is a like, hey,
Yeah,
we're just gonna get together and fight with daggers.
but you see Fiore's techniques.
You do.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
even though he has the same approach of Vadi, so someone is going to assault you with with a dagger, and you
Yeah.
have to survive. Still, the technical luggage is that of Fiore.
Well, and the other thing that I find really interesting too is that section of Marazzo, he wrote for two of his students, right? And they were definitely his senior students because he talks about how like he refers to one of them as almost being like his son, right? And it's like, okay, so obviously he had a long-term relationship with these two people, and when they asked him to give him or give them some advice on how to fight with a dagger just in case they ever needed to, like, and I think it might even say that if you ever get attacked in the street or something like that. And so Marazzo ended up putting together these specific techniques and then just kind of slaps it in the end of the book, even though he's already treated dagger like in his treatise, and he's done it with the longer
Yeah,
dagger, like the Bolognese dagger. You get these plays that are these sort of like special things, which is really interesting. So I don't know, maybe he was looking at something and was like, I don't really know what to do if you get jumped. And then he was like, what is this book? This is Fiore. Okay, I'm gonna read this. And he's like, these are the plays you guys should do.
that's a chance. But also, I think that talking about Maros and his students and what he was sure would walk in the street and what wouldn't. Um, Again, controversial opinion. Okay,
Fire
this is
away.
the controversial opinions. Uh, in Morozzo's work in introduction, you have him. casually putting down a sentence, which in English should sound like, um, and in case you should ever need to have a fight for real, I hope this serves you well.
Hmm.
So he's talking to someone going to be a master of fencing, going to teach people, and he tells him, if you will ever have a real fight. So the student never ever had an actual real fight.
Yeah.
So when we look at transmission of fencing, we keep thinking probably here in Italy we are so influenced by Fiore, and we keep thinking of him talking about his 5 duels with camouflage gloves and sharps. 5.
Yeah.
We are Himays. Keep thinking that people fought duels every day or whatever. Uh, we don't have records of fights with sharps. Basically, I think someone found one. It was two masters of fencing, and they both got condemned after because they wounded each other or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. You're thinking about the Tallhofer one?
No, 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 no. I think someone found an actual chronicle of a sharp fight
Hmm.
in the 15th century, one in the 15th century,
Yeah.
and it ended up with that being two masters of fencing, and they were allowed because they were trying to demonstrate that one of the two was more worthy than the other of being a master of fencing or whatever. I remember I read this on someone else's research, and it ended up with them both wounding each other, and so they got both punished by the king because they were wounding each other in a duel. So it wasn't that much of a real world practice to 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 sword each other in duels. Okay. So when we talk about stuff that would work in the street, we have to consider that there's the chance that the person teaching it would have never actually tried that
Yeah.
for real with sharps. And Marozzo plainly tells you, student, you are going to become a master of fencing. This is my last advice. I hope you never have to do it for real. And
Yeah.
if you ever have, I hope this works.
Yeah. It's funny because in his sword and dagger section, he more or less says that he's making up what he's doing. It feels like that material is like kind of early, like sword and dagger is kind of coming into vogue as a style of fighting. So he's addressing it as more of a style of fighting rather than just something you would do if you were in a desperate situation. But it seems like he's relatively unsure of himself as he's going through his plays, which I find fascinating. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, but it also makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense because why would you have ever seen sword and dagger in the 15th century
I don't know.
with which sword? Arming sword and dagger, full of manuals of arming sword and dagger, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
uh, so yeah, I think that probably I won't say he was making it all up, but I'd say that he was probably adapting some stuff from the sword and buckler
It,
and
yeah.
summing it up with his own tests, probably at the south. But
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what I'm getting at is I feel like it it's almost like there's unsurety, not necessarily from like a standpoint of like it's just complete BS, right? But it's more of he doesn't feel like he's ever had a chance to test it,
yeah,
And I feel like that's the feeling that I get from it is like he's gone through these plays, they work in a controlled setting, but he's not 100% sure that they would work in an earnest fight.
yeah, and this him being honest about that more or less marks a huge difference to Vadi and Fiore.
Hmm.
Because Fiore constantly keeps reminding you that he actually fought duels, and he also tells you that the stuff you're going to fight is basically BS because he has actually fought with sharps and you're going to fight in armor, you as the recipient of the manual.
Mhm.
So he tells you, oh, but I've been fighting 5 duels without armor and with sharp with just camouflage gloves. Uh, Kids these days are only fighting in armor, and they can bash each other as much as they want. They can take many wounds and still keep fighting. He tells you it basically this way. I didn't paraphrase it even a lot, apart from the kids these days part.
Yeah.
And then you move to Vadi, who seems to be rather concerned about keeping telling you the stuff he is writing down is proper, it's good, yet keeps omitting having used it.
Hmm.
So we move from, I've actually used this and I guarantee to you everything you'll see in this manual I have personally witnessed or done. He tells you witnessed or done. So not everything in the manual Fiore tried. He witnessed it in real combat or did it in real combat.
Yeah.
You move to Vadi. I guarantee this is all good and genuine. Full stop.
Full
Then
stop.
to Morocco. I'm basically making up some of this. I think it's going to work. I hope you never have to try.
Well, I almost wonder too, and this will probably not go well with a lot of people, but I've been, in the last podcast I did, I talked a little bit of smack about Marazzo's two-handed sword too, so we'll just keep it going. But the differentiation between an assaulti and an abattimenti, right?
Uh-huh.
And with the two-handed sword and sword and small buckler, it's very clear that those actions are supposed to be done in the cell. And I wonder if the difference is that there wasn't that level of practical knowledge to verify it. That that created made it an assaulty rather than made it an abattimenti. Right? Because when you get a sharp sword and you're fighting with sword and large buckler, or sword and targa, like he's very clear, like that these things will work. Manciolino makes the same distinction, um, and even with sword alone. But when he gets to the two-handed sword, or even when you're fighting with a sword and small buckler, you know that you're fighting with a blunt weapon.
Yeah, but I think that mm, this this is part of the reason why so much of the Bolognese stuff is shown in that sort of kata approach, I
Yeah,
would call it.
yeah,
Uh, it's a different mental approach to fighting because you are basically at a school learning how to do stuff, hoping you never have to do it. Uh, that's basically HEMA.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a great
Technically,
point.
I would say that Marozza's Sal was probably a HEMA Sal. Okay.
Yeah,
And that's pretty different from what you see in Fiore's works and in the Lichtenauer traditions works. And there we get to another controversial topic, probably. Because when you read Fiore's works, you have the clear perception he's teaching someone who is going to fight. He's teaching someone to fight,
yeah,
not how he should fight. He's preparing them for a fight.
yeah,
And yet, I honestly think that Fiore knows. No, this is said the wrong way. I think that he's teaching, keeping in mind, yeah, not knowing, keeping in mind that the person he's teaching to is going to wear armor.
hmm,
Even when he goes through the part of fencing. And this is another problem with Lichtenauer people. They keep saying Blospectin. Fiore never tells you that the stuff in his manual is meant to be done without the armor. He draws part of it without the armor and tells you this is the art of fencing, and then draws part of it with the armor. And this is what you do specifically when you're wearing armor. But then if you go through the stuff that's drawn without armor, a few techniques say don't do this if you're not wearing armor.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's not plus effective.
No, it's not.
Because he even tells you don't do this if you're not wearing armor. So what he is teaching you is the basics of fencing and fencing actions, but he is keeping in mind you're going to be wearing armor. Otherwise, some actions don't make any sense. There's times in which he loses blade contact in the face of the other one and goes half swording to stab him in the guts. That's your head on his blade.
Yeah.
Under that, please do this with the armor on. Ah, okay.
Well, and we kind of get that a little bit with, I mean, you could maybe this is an artifact, but even with Marazzo, you know, when he talks about half sorting, or German, what would the KDF people would call half sorting, he
Yeah.
calls it fighting with sword and armor. Like when you put
Yeah.
your hand on the blade, you're fighting with sword and armor. And that could just be sort of a historical note. And maybe for like Marazzo in particular, he's almost like Vadi, where it's more of just kind of writing this love letter of like, this is the two-handed sword that was once used, and you know, this is how it would be used these days if people still use the two-handed sword with any frequency. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that's probably the case. I think there's a huge difference in goal of teaching between Maroth and Fiore. And I think Vad is somewhere between because he wants to be Fiore, but he's actually Marotho. Maybe not even, because we don't have any track of him having actually taught fencing to anyone.
Yeah, he's also a Hemaist.
Yeah, maybe he's even a Hemaist without practicing. We don't know. But in any case, what I was going to with the previous topic is that uh, keeping in mind the context of what you are studying sometimes helps, not sometimes, probably most times, helps you understanding what you are studying. And so when you are studying Marotto's works and Mancelino's works and Anonymous works and whatever, so Bolognese stuff, you have to consider why they are teaching something. They are teaching side sword. They had a salle with people coming there, paying them to learn side sword because they were bourgeois or whatever and wanted to know how to fight. Fine, he's teaching personal defense classes.
Mhm.
So he's teaching you the stuff that's needed to survive a duel or an assault in the town. He's teaching you two-handed sword. That's another thing. He's not teaching you personal defense classes. He's trying to teach you the art of fencing. How I would do it if I had to do it with something we are not using anymore, with something I haven't tried. So that's to be kept in mind because we have this sort of reverence for the manual and the author, and we sometimes forget that they were also humans and had a job and had to keep that job going.
Yeah.
And so when we study Bolognese, we have to keep this in mind. And when we study Fiore, we have to keep this in mind. And when we study the German tradition, we have to keep this in mind. They may have had, in my opinion, they definitely had different goals in transmitting their fencing knowledge. And this brings to different ways of transmitting it and different things being transmitted.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point. And so that actually kind of leads into the next thing. How do you view the tactical and strategic approach to the systems that you study?
So, this is an interesting question to me, also because a majority of what I teach is tactical approach in fencing. So, I
Perfect.
mean that 70% of the stuff I teach is tactical approach in fencing. Uh, because I think that in the end, that's the key. Okay, what's really transmitted in the manuals is the tactical approach of fencing, because we said it before, they are not really transmitting how to perform stuff, except for Lichtenauer, who is methodically teaching you every single cut and every single strike and every single action, every single thing. A great majority of fencing masters and people writing treatises over the centuries have been teaching us how to fence more than what to do when fencing, and why doing things more than how to do them. So to me, tactical approach in fencing and in HEMA is putting a difference between the what and the why. To me, tactical approach to fencing is the why. And that's probably one of the strongest points in dabbing into both Bolognese and Fiore, because you have the immense amount of tactical knowledge Fiore left us, and the amount of technical knowledge the Bolognese school left to us between Marozzo and Manciolini especially. So when talking about tactics, I tend to rely on Fiore. Even when teaching Bolognese, apart from purely Bolognese stuff, okay, as an example, Bolognese fencing is far more developed in invitations. But apart from purely Bolognese stuff, like the amount of invitations you have between straight and larga guards and all of that stuff, for the basics of tactical approach, I tend to rely on Fiore, because his system developed as a series of layers is, in my opinion, one of the strongest ones to teach tactical approach. So you have the first kings, which are the first things to check guards. And then you have the second kings, second masters, which are the actions. So what's happening? Is he throwing a thrust? Is he throwing a cut? Is he parrying my action? Is he stepping sideways? What's happening? And then you have the students, which are the reactions to the situations. So you have the master doing the thing and the student having to react. This is how Fiore wrote his treatise, okay?
Yeah.
And then you have the players, which are the ones enacting the actions the students have to counter. So basically, Fiore is telling you, if you don't have the basics of tactics, which is the guards, you're done. If you don't understand that if that guy is in that position, in that, I don't call guards positions. I used to call them intentions, because to me, guards are concepts of intention, not of position.
Yeah, because they communicate what the person's going to do, right? I mean,
you have to read what the person's going to do through that. Because if I am communicating to you what I'm going to do by my guard, I'm an idiot. But if you're good, you can read my guard.
yeah,
And so, yeah, you can read through the guard the intentions of the other person, which means that the guard is relative to their intentions. Okay,
right.
so I call guards something that is tied to your intention. If you can't read the intentions, you're already done. Those are the first masters of battle.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do that, you're out. Then you have read their possible intentions. Situation happens. The other guy does something, or you do something. Situation happens. Second master of battle. You have to understand the situation, because you can't just do always the same thing against the same guard. That guard can lead to multiple things. That's
Right.
the tree of decision making, of tactical decision making. Decision making starts from your guard, which means your intention. And then you choose the action you're taking from this intention. When you take the action, The ball is to the other one. Did he read it correctly? He's going to react. A student, if he has studied correctly, he can react. If he hasn't studied correctly, he's fucked.
Yeah. 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 You know,
Yeah,
it's I draw a similar comparison in the Bolognese tactics, and maybe this is something that we can also draw upon to really kind of highlight the similarity between maybe it's the Italian approach. Is that the guards really are the most important aspect of understanding the tactical approach. Um, you know, when I think about the Bolognese system in particular, so much of it is like if you just take Marazzo's what I call the progression through the guards, it's that middle section where he has like the different guard pictures, but he has roughly like a half page to talk about each one, and he tells you this is where
yeah,
you're going to now put your students in this guard, now put your students in this guard, now put your students in this guard. But he gives like little tactical tidbits there that are really interesting, and it's clear that that's the frame of how he wants you to teach a student how to fence, right? Like, and it all starts from that construct. And Mancellino relatively gives us something very similar where you get attacks from the guards, right? Like, starting with the sword and small buckler, but you're getting he tells you how to every single type of attack. He actually follows Marazzo's advice. Like you could plug Mancellino into Marazzo for this section, and you could get like you could figure out what Marazzo's actually trying to
yeah,
say again.
yeah,
But he gives all the attacks, and then he gives the counters to those actions, right? Which is just like Fiore's the way that
yeah.
Fiore teaches his students. And
But
so like if you were to take all of that and lay it out, like understanding the guards, understanding how to attack the guards, but also the ways to defend in the guards when you're in those positions and somebody attacks you, is so crucial. And if you understand that, you can relatively make predictable reactions based on what your opponent is doing.
but those guards in Marazzo's work are somewhere in the middle of the manual.
Yeah,
Okay, but why are they there?
that's a great question. I've
I
wondered
have my
the exact
answer,
same
but I
thing.
want to hear yours first.
Um, I don't really think that I have a good explanation for why he puts it in the middle. Because he does the same thing with the two-handed sword. He goes through his guards well after he's gone through his plays.
Yeah,
So I don't know.
to me at least, that's because if you don't have the basics of sword fighting, if you haven't tried crossing blades, and if you don't have the idea of what can happen when you are crossing blades against an action, you can't be predictive. So while Fiore is teaching people that are already strong in their understanding of fencing, so he can drop the guards at the beginning,
Mm,
because the other person is going to understand that if the sword is going to fall on their head, they're going to get cracked. Marotta isn't. He's teaching noobs, I would say, and so not the people the manual is directed to, but that's a teaching manual for a teacher.
yeah,
So he is showing them, start off with having them fence a bit, or at least simulate fencing and getting used to the actions, and then drop on them the guards
interesting.
with their tactical reasoning, so that now they can go through that again, understanding where it's going from where it's starting. So first show them where it's going, and then show them how to guess it before it starts.
That's really interesting because so all right, because the Anonimo does something actually really similar. If you look through the Anonimo, the first and I don't know if this is just the way that Stephen Freitas put together the Anonimo, the English translation of the Anonimo, but in the 400 section, because I know that he combined the two treatises that are available. But in the 400 section, like actually, I think it starts in the 300s. There's a series of plays that almost read like Delagokie, where Delagokie gives you this one action. He gives you the offensive side, and then he gives you the counter, right? He does that with the provocations.
Yeah,
Anonimo goes through and does provocations from all of the main guard. Well, he goes through Codalonga Stretta, Porta de Ferro Stretta, Cinghiari Porta de Ferro, and there's another one that I'm forgetting. But either way, he goes through um, all the basic guards that you would go through, and he gives you the attacks and the counters, and it reads a lot like Delagoke, but it also reads like that simple thing, and he does it towards the end of his treatise, which actually kind of fits to that idea that he's already taught you all these like different progressions and things, a way of doing them, and then you get this like block of text that reads like, well, now these are like almost like set plays that you would go for, which is really interesting.
I think that this is the kind of understanding, I would call it, that you get when you work through both sources or multiple sources and then question yourself and question the masters.
Yeah.
As long as you don't question why did the master do that, and only drink from the cup without questioning where the milk comes from, okay, uh, you don't make this kind of reasoning, and you don't grow as an instructor, not as much as you could at least. And I really like Marozzo for that. I'm far less competent on the Lagocchie and the Anonimo than I am on Marozzo and Manciolino, because Marozzo is my main focus in the Bolognese system, and Manciolino is my instrument to make Marozzo understandable.
Yeah.
So Marozzo is my favorite because he's teaching you to teach.
Yep.
And we should not forget that. What I said before, why is he transmitting his fencing? Manciolino is transmitting the fencing to teach you fencing. Marozzo is transmitting the fencing to teach you how to teach the fencing.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's why Manciolino is necessary to Marozzo if you have to learn fencing. You first have to learn fencing, then you have to learn how to structure it into a teachable thing.
Yeah, that's really great. Um, yeah, take that, all the people that want to talk smack about Morazzo. Yeah, I love that. Um, so what is something that you think that we as a community can do to improve upon our, or better reflect the resources in our fencing? I'm not sure that actually came out as a sentence. Let me say that again. What is something that you think we as a community can improve upon to better reflect the sources in our fencing?
Well, I think that uh, this is the perfect question for what we have already been talking about. I mean, um, I think that we could, as a community overall, uh, start questioning what we are doing and what the masters were doing and why the masters were doing something. Not questioning in the sense that maybe they were bad or whatever, but questioning why the masters were leaving the stuff they left. Because up to now, I've seen mostly fencers reading through masters' works and thinking of those as documents that are there because they are there. Why did Marozzo write his book? Because he wanted to write a book. Marozzo wrote his book because he wanted to teach someone how to teach.
Hmm.
When you understand that, you probably start studying from Manciolino. This is what we could improve as a community, starting to question, probably question isn't the right word in English, to wonder, to think why masters left out has their books, and how this can influence the way we learn from them. And this is probably especially true over the large debate between German and Italian medieval fencing. Why did the KDF masters leave their books? Why did Fiore leave his books? Why did the KDF masters teach fencing to their students? Why did Fiore? They had pretty different reasons for doing that.
Yeah.
Pretty different. And so the form of teaching changes. And to me, that's a good deal of the perceived difference between the systems. Bringing that back to the Bolognese, why did the Bolognese masters teach each one of them, and how can that reflect on how we can use the material he left to us? I think this is going to be an important part of the further development of our community, since a good deal of the manuals have been discovered and translated and everything. So I don't think there's much more new fencing stuff to discover, and I don't think individual work can go much more forward into interpretation and translation of stuff. I mean, at least for the major authors. Obviously, less known authors still have work to be done on them. But if you talk about Fiore, there's probably 20 publications about it right now.
Hmm.
What use would it be to pull out another translation and another interpretation without adding to it this understanding of why it's important to study Fiore's work? Because nobody actually thinks about that. Why is it important to study this master, his work, this section of his work? What was he trying to convey?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in last week's episode, I talked to David Biggs, and we talked about a little bit about the anonymous Vienna, um, that Tom Leone translated, that he found and translated, and it's really interesting because that's written from the perspective of a student, and something that I'm hearing a lot from a lot of people is really trying to understand the framework and the mindset of the people who are using this. So learning from somebody who is a student that's taking notes from a master is super important. I think that's a lot of where like research is going right now, not necessarily focusing on the masters themselves, but trying to look to what were the students writing and trying to find those documents from students and stuff like that. But you kind of hit on something that Michael Chidester actually brought up, where he was talking about that's what his big search is now. So I don't know if you are a member of Patreon and if you follow like Wiktenauer on Patreon.
No,
Um,
I actually don't, but I may.
yeah,
I'm
it's
curious
worth it
for
because this is what he's doing actually. So whenever he comes across, he's been looking for documents of actual sword fights that happened, and he's essentially compiling all these documents. So he's got all of the duels from all of Fiore's students are like on there, and you can read them. And so that's what he's been doing. He's just been going around looking for accounts of sword fights, whether it's a fight that happens in the street or whether it's a fight that happens in a formal duel between two knights, And so that's really interesting because that will give us those data points, I think, that you're kind of hoping that we'll find, right? Like not necessarily from the perspective of the masters, but more of an idea of why was this important? Like what were how was fencing actually used at the time? And that'll help us understand why did the masters write what they wrote, right? Because yeah, I mean that's the question. I mean, why did Marazzo include the two-handed sword? And why did he do 3 books on the two-handed sword? Why was it so important to him? And why is it an abattimente instead of an assault? Or why is it an assault instead of an abattimente? And, you know, is that just because that was something that people like to see it at shows? Is it something that they could do at festivals or something like that? Or, some sort of like a play fighting? But at the same time, there still seems to be this earnest edge to it, where if you read book 3, you're kicking people in the nuts or you're pommeling them in the face. And so if you're doing that, like, okay, well, that sounds like earnest fencing to me. So I don't know.
yeah, that's probably what I would see. I would like to see the community going to towards. Not all of it, maybe, but at least um, uh, um, consistent part enough of the community that we get a development in that direction.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on and joining me. I know it's super late for you right now.
Oh, no worries. It's 3:30 a.m.
All right, it's pretty late. Um, so, but I definitely want to thank you for coming on and sharing all that with us. And I mean, what can I say, man? I'm super excited about your gloves. I want to talk to you again though, because I think I have even more questions after talking to you now, where I really want to
Why
get
not?
even deeper on some of these topics because you are
Why not?
as much a man of wisdom as much as you are a great glove designer. So I'd love to talk about to you about this some more.
Well, thanks for inviting me over. And again, we can have a second round. No worries.
Cool. Well, I look forward to it. You take care.
Thank you, and have a good afternoon, evening,
Evening.
probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you're on the East Coast.
Yep. All right. Bye bye.
Bye.
And that concludes another episode of Le Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. I want to thank Dario Alberto Magnani again for coming on, talking about his gloves and a little bit about Fiore and Vadi and the Bolognese system. Next week's guest is we're going to kind of continue down this trope. I hope everybody is sort of enjoying this little bit of a diversion. But next week's guest is going to be Greg Millet of the Chicago Sword Guild, and we're going to discuss this information in further detail and really kind of get into the bones of how we can really kind of use Fiore and Vadi to inform our understanding of Achille Marazzo's two-handed sword. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.